Being with us, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where those videos are available to watch anytime afterward, except for last week's. And let me apologize to anyone who was trying to watch it. We had just a massive computer failure, and I apologize, but that one, if you weren't here in the room for it, you don't get to see it. If you have not already done so, please silence your cell phones. From Gulf shrimpers to Copiah County truck farmers, Mississippi has a rich food history. Tomorrow evening from 5 to 7, we'll focus on that delicious topic at our History Happy Hour, which includes free admission to these museums, flash tours, live entertainment, and refreshments from Nick Wallace Culinary. So join us for that. And don't forget that at 10:30 and noon on Saturdays, our own Hezekiah Watkins will tell his story in the Central Gallery of the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum of how he became, at age 13, the youngest freedom rider. We'll take next week off and enjoy the holiday, then be back here on Wednesday, November 29th with Larry Morrissey and Terrence Shirley, who will present Knots in the Safety Net, Oral Histories of the Community Health Centers of Mississippi. Today, I am delighted to welcome Ty Sedgley to talk about his book, Robert E. Lee and Me, A Southerner's Reckoning with the Myth of the Lost Cause. Retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Ty Sedgley is a visiting professor of history at Hamilton College and professor emeritus and former head of the history department at West Point. He served as vice chair for the Congressional Naming Commission that was tasked to rename Department of Defense assets that honor Confederates. Sedgley's book, Robert E. Lee and Me, was named a Best Book of 2021 by National Public Radio, Forbes, and other news outlets. He is the author or editor of 6 other books on military history, 3 of which won distinguished writing prizes, and his video lecture, Was the Civil War About Slavery?, has 35 million views on social media. Help me welcome Ty Sedgley.
Thanks, Chris. Oh, thank you so much. Thanks, Chris. And great to be back in Jackson. Great to be in Mississippi. I have fond memories of Jackson. I met Governor William Winter at the National World War II Museum, and he told me an amazing story about growing up a segregationist and then commanding black troops in World War II and how that changed him. And after that, we developed a little bit of a relationship, and we sent cadets every year to Jackson and to meet with him at what was then the William Winter Institute. And then I visited him in his home with Elise, and it was amazing. It was going into this area of just like going to an American History Museum where there were, if any of you have been in his home, it pictures ceiling to wall of all the great Americans that he knew, that he had met. And it was in the Army, we have a saying for that, is we don't get bonuses. So we get things from every assignment we've ever been in, and we call it an I Love Me wall. And there has never been a better I Love Me wall than what Governor Winter had. And it was amazing to be there. And I also want to congratulate you. This is the first time I've been back in Jackson since I've seen the new flag up on the state capitol. And it's a flag flying proudly over the capitol. And as Mississippi U.S. Army Civil War veterans we used to say, and remember, there were lots of Mississippians who served in the United States Army during the Civil War. They might say, huzzah. So, okay, today, and I guess the one other thing I would tell you is that I have another connection. My dad is from Mississippi, born in Biloxi and raised there, and in fact, then went north to Virginia as a high school teacher. And in fact, one of his students, Peyton Prosper, is here, who the last time I saw Peyton was in 1970. So he taught there, and then eventually sort of semi-retired back to Gulfport and taught in the Harrison County school system for a number of years. Can't wait to send him this video. He is 92 and is the Florida State over 90s double tennis champion. He and his partner were the only entries. So it's great to be here, and I'm here today to talk to you and to give you a little history. And what is history? History, I think, is storytelling with a purpose using evidence. Facts don't change people, but stories do. So today I'm telling stories My story, the story of Confederate monuments, and the story of how our country stopped commemorating Confederates in the military. My purpose. First, I hope to make you feel uncomfortable. I am uncomfortable telling my own story, and I feel uncomfortable about this country's racism. But uncomfortable causes no lasting damage. Uncomfortable, in fact, is called education. Second, I want to tell you why I think we must confront the history of the Civil War and the Confederate legacy, including the monuments right here in Jackson. If you see the Confederates for what they were, we have a better chance of understanding who we are today. My third purpose, I believe we can make a difference, individually and collectively. But first, we have to understand our history. And I hope today to give you some of my hard-earned wisdom through history. So first, my story. In 2015, I wrote and recorded in uniform a video called Was the Civil War About Slavery? I answered the question in the first sentence. The citizens of the southern states were willing to fight and die to preserve the morally repugnant institution of slavery. The video went viral, and as Chris said today, it has 35 million views on YouTube and Facebook. Oh boy, did I receive some input from my fellow Americans. Death threats to my West Point email address. Americans wanted to kill me for saying the Civil War was about slavery. And what did I learn? History is dangerous because it challenges our myths and our identity. I also learned that I have a face made for podcasts. My son sent me a link to a website where they made fun of my looks. People said I look like an alien. A few wrote that my face proved that there really was an Area 51 and the feds failed to lock the front gate. Who knew, said another, that a light bulb could wear glasses. One wrote that I didn't have a forehead, I had a 5 head. Funny and true. That's an oldie but a goodie. And even more people were upset. Why? Many people grew up with a lie, a myth called the lost cause. And what is that lost cause myth? After the war, white Southerners argued that the Civil War wasn't fought over slavery, because if the war was about slavery, then Confederates fought a dishonorable war for a dishonorable cause, slavery. Yet the facts are clear. As Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy, said, and here I quote, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition." Or we can look at the Mississippi Article of Secession, which is right here in the museum. Quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with slavery, the greatest material interest in the world." The Lost Cause argued that enslaved liked slavery. Lies. Slavery featured legal rape, selling husband from wife, separating mother from child. Another aspect of this lost cause was that Reconstruction, the period from 1865 to 1877, was that they argued it was evil. Of course, that's just a lie, too. Reconstruction gave us our first civil rights laws, the 14th Amendment, promising equal rights under the law for all. Reconstruction was a valiant attempt at biracial democracy. And Robert E. Lee was the hero of the lost cause, a human without sin, the greatest military leader ever. I'll talk about him in a bit, but there's one thing to remember about Robert E. Lee. He did lose, like by a lot. Ulysses S. Grant destroyed his army. The lost cause had a pernicious purpose: to ensure white people maintained political power at the expense of black people. Starting in the 1890s, Southern state constitutions, including Mississippi, deprived African Americans of citizenship. White Virginians boldly stated the purpose of their constitution in 1902. Congressman Carter Glass exclaimed, quote, "Discrimination? Why, that is precisely what we propose. That exactly is the purpose of this convention, which was elected for, was to discriminate with a view to the elimination of every Negro voter who can be gotten rid of," end quote. Remember, in 1910, South Carolina and Mississippi were still majority African American. Additionally, the new constitutions enshrined segregation. White supremacy was enforced by a terror campaign of lynching. White mobs lynched 5,000 black men, women, and children more and more grotesquely, like something out of the medieval era. So how do I know about this lost cause myth? Well, because I've studied it for the last 20 years. That's true, but here's my secret, my uncomfortable fact. I grew up believing this myth, believing this lie. That's me on the left with hair, rocking the plaid bell bottoms. If I had hair, I would still be wearing those pants right now. Proud child of the 70s. On the right was the picture that hung over our mantle when I was a kid, the 4 flags of the Confederacy. The one on the far right was the national flag, called the Stainless Banner, mostly white. Why white? Well, here's what a Savannah newspaper editor said, quote, "As a people, we are fighting to maintain the heaven-ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. A white flag would thus be emblematical of our cause. They wore," end quote, "they wore their white supremacy proudly." Of course, having a white flag on a battlefield, maybe not the best idea anybody's ever had before. But that still makes us uncomfortable to know about that. And the flag we think of as the Confederate banner today was actually the flag of Lee's army. You notice on the bottom it says Dixie. I hate to admit this, but as a kid, I learned the words to Dixie before I learned the words to the Star-Spangled Banner. The song starts, quote, "I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old times there are not forgotten." And what are those old times? Slavery. Horrible. My culture reinforced the lost cause. On the left is my first chapter book. Lee looks like a god on loan from Mount Olympus. Notice the little orange lion in the upper right-hand corner. It's a book for kids, uncomfortable. On the right is my 7th grade Virginia history textbook. The African family dressed in colonial finery is supposed to be exiting a ship from Africa. Entering slavery for generations, it looks like they just got off a Princess cruise ship. No, they just crossed the Middle Passage. 15% of Africans died on those hellish voyages. The book describes slavery as a type of social security, kind masters and happy slaves, terrible lies. And what about the whip? Just the way fathers discipline kids. Teachers used these textbooks in Virginia through the 1970s. And I know you're thinking, that's not really the South, it's a DC suburb. Well, when I was growing up, it was a lost cause outpost. I didn't know that Virginia used to be part of the District of Columbia. George Washington demanded that his hometown be in the district. Alexandria retroceded to Virginia in 1847. Why? To protect the slave trade. Uncomfortable. So today, the Potomac is the western edge of District of Columbia, but it wasn't like that when George Washington was there. When I lived here, we had a big Confederate monument. So there's my hometown. When I lived in Alexandria, we had a big monument downtown, the one on your left. Why are monuments a big deal? Most Confederate monuments went up between 1890 and 1920. Confederate monuments celebrated the return of the South to political and social dominance by whites. Many of the speeches talked about Anglo-Saxons returning to power after attempts at biracial democracy during Reconstruction. I should say the white South. Too often when we say the South, the white is silent. Here's an example of a monument at Arlington National Cemetery. Run by the U.S. Army, it has a Confederate monument created in 1914. It is a pro-slavery monument with an overweight enslaved woman cradling the baby of her enslaver with a tear in her eye to show us that the enslaved supported the Confederacy, supported slavery. It's a middle finger to the United States, saying that the white South was right and the United States was wrong. Uncomfortable, monstrous. Confederate memorialization was all around me, but I didn't notice. Alexandria has more streets named after Confederates than any other city in the country. Why? Alexandria only spent 6 hours in the Confederacy before the United States occupied it. In 1953, Alexandria passed a law to name new streets after Confederates. Guess where? It was in the African American section of town. Confederate memorialization protested Truman's Civil Rights Commission and the court cases that would become Brown versus the Board, leading to desegregation. One street is named after William Quantrell, the war criminal who never wore a uniform. He slaughtered civilian men and boys in Lawrence, Kansas. Scratch a Confederate monument, and it either celebrates white supremacy or protests equal rights. two sides of the same coin. My family left Alexandria as my dad took a job as a headmaster of a new school in Monroe, Georgia. George Walton Academy is a segregation academy. 400 seg academies were created in 1969 alone when the federal government finally started forcing the white South to integrate. I know you have plenty of them here in Mississippi. The purpose of my school was to ensure white kids didn't go to school with black kids. Uncomfortable. I didn't know then, when I lived there, that my new home was the site of the last mass lynching in American history, the Moores Ford lynching. In 1946, a posse of white men stalked, trapped, and slaughtered 2 men and 2 women, including 1 veteran. The purpose? Terrorize the black community and enforce white supremacy. Despite a platoon of FBI agents camping in Monroe for months, no one was ever indicted, much less convicted. Yet I knew nothing, clueless to the racial violence all around me. I left Georgia for college, and I chose a college that worshiped Robert E. Lee because I wanted to be a Virginia gentleman like Lee. I wanted status and power. That was my culture. Uncomfortable. And while there, I took an ROTC scholarship because I ran out of money. I spent nearly 4 decades in uniform. I'm a proud soldier. I love my country. But at the age of 18, I joined for the money. Here I am, with hair again, next to a picture of my then hero, Robert E. Lee, in Lee Chapel. The statue of Lee is of him resting on the battlefield in Confederate uniform. There are no Christian symbols in the chapel. The entire chapel worshiped Lee. It was a reliquary to a saint. Uncomfortable, even blasphemous. I received my commission there, surrounded by Confederate flags. Uncomfortable. Then I raised my right hand and took the oath everyone who serves in the federal government takes, including the military, to, quote, support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Ever wonder why it talks about domestic enemies? Because that oath was written in 1862. It's an anti-Confederate oath. Yet I took that oath surrounded by Confederate flags. I started my Army career the next day at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, named after Confederate Braxton Bragg, a terrible commander and a worse person. The Army had 9 posts named after Confederates, named after the enemy. Today there is none left. 2 weeks ago, I went to the changing ceremony that changed Fort Gordon to Fort Eisenhower. The old names of those posts reflect traitors, war criminals, terrible generals, and cruel enslavers. So let's talk about Fort Gordon at the top, named for Confederate General John Brown Gordon. He never served in the U.S. Army, but he killed U.S. Army soldiers. After the Civil War, he gave a speech to black citizens of Charleston, South Carolina. He said to them, if you are to demand equality, he said, the 40 million white people will exterminate the 4 million black people in a race war. He founded the Ku Klux Klan and served as its Grand Dragon in Georgia. Uncomfortable. So that is John Brown Gordon right in the center there. And some of the other ones, A.P. Hill, Benning, Polk, and Bragg on the right. And I won't talk about all of them, but I will talk about George Pickett, the namesake of from Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg. But he also executed 23 U.S. Army soldiers in 1864. And when the war ended, he skedaddled to Canada because he feared the noose as a war criminal. And when were these posts named? They were named in World War I and World War II, not right after the Civil War. Remember that during the World Wars, the military was segregated, believing in white supremacy, racist through and through. Read this report that I found in the archives from the Army in 1932 when they were trying to figure out how to use black manpower. Quote, the Negro is lower in the scale of evolutionary development than the white, end quote. Ignoring the bravery of the black soldier in the Civil War and World War I, the white Army planners thought black soldiers wouldn't fight because of unadulterated racism. They were wrong, completely wrong, but that still makes us feel uncomfortable. I spent half my career on tanks and as a cavalry officer. The other half as an academic at West Point. And there, I had my epiphany. Our family lived on Lee Road, by Lee Gate, in Lee housing area, next to Lee Child Development Center. One day I walked past our barracks, and West Point names its barracks after the greatest heroes in American military history: MacArthur, Washington, Eisenhower, Pershing, Grant, Sherman, and Lee. Why was a barracks named after Robert E. Lee? After all, he was a colonel in the United States Army. So I ran around Post, that's what we call Army bases, Post, looking, and I found 12 things named after Lee. And I changed. Why did I change? 3 things. First, my identity changed. I no longer cared about being a Southern gentleman. I wanted to be the best Army officer I could. Serving in the Army, serving my country changed me. Second, my wife changed me. She is incapable of lying. And it took a couple of decades because I'm slow, but she changed me. And now I was a scholar, a historian, and the archives changed me. The facts changed me. I found that in the 19th century, West Point officers banished Confederates as traitors. I read the U.S. Constitution. There's only one crime. Article 3, Section 3, levying war against the United States is treason. That blew me away. Treason. They killed U.S. Army soldiers. And that's what all those who served in blue during the Civil War said. Traitors, treason. I looked around Post. There were no Confederates on our cemetery. None on Battle Monument on the left, dedicated to those who died during the War of the Rebellion. That's the official name of the war in the 19th century. Heck, even the motto, duty, honor, country, also anti-Confederate. You can't have a duty and honor without country first. So when did the Confederate memorials arrive? Back to the archives. The first Confederate memorialization happened in the 1930s. That was when the first black cadet in the 20th century graduated, Benjamin O. Davis Jr., later leader of the Tuskegee Airmen, the Red Tails. And this portrait of Lee in gray with an enslaved servant was done in 1952, when the Army was fighting to stay segregated. Lee Barracks was named in the early 1970s, when minority admission started. Instead of a handful of blacks coming each year, tokenism, there were now dozens. Confederate memorials protested integration. All Confederate monuments celebrate white supremacy or protest equal rights, sort of the same thing. When I realized that, I hope you'll forgive my language, but I'm a soldier, that pissed me off. Seriously, I was mad at my own obtuseness, mad at the institutions I loved. West Point and the Army had visible signs of racism all around, and yet nobody noticed. Then I started looking at my hero, Robert E. Lee. Lee is the godlike figure of a lost cause religion. Is his supposed greatness also a myth? And here's what I found. No other Army officer profited from enslaved people more than Lee. Lee took 2 years paid administrative leave from the Army, from his regiment in Texas, to run his father-in-law's plantations. Man, I hate that term, plantation. It makes me think of hoop-skirted ladies and gentlemen dancing like Gone with the Wind. No, plantations were gulags, site of mass atrocities, rape, torture, labor theft. We should call them enslaved labor farms because they harvested 2 things, cotton and humans. Enslavers would rape enslaved women and then sell their own children and grandchildren. I just had a grandson. Any grandparents in the audience? It is the best thing ever. Oh my gosh. I love it. I've never felt such joy. In the enslaved era, fathers and grandfathers would sell their own children and grandchildren. It's beyond uncomfortable. It's just monstrous. Lee had enslaved men and women, whipped. He separated husband from wife, mother from child. And what about Lee's decision to fight for the Confederacy? Did he have to go with the South? No. In 1861, there were eight U.S. Army colonels from Virginia, all West Point grads. 7 remained loyal to the United States. Lee and only Lee chose treason. Why? Because he believed in slavery. Full stop. During the war, Lee's army used thousands of enslaved people for his army's logistics and asked Jefferson Davis for more all the time. When Lee went north for the Antietam and Gettysburg campaign, every part of his army kidnapped free black people and brought them back to Virginia for sale. His army slaughtered African-American prisoners of war, especially at the Battle of the Crater. After the Civil War, Lee testified before Congress, U.S. Congress, that if it was up to him, he would kick out all black people from the state of Virginia. He advocated racial cleansing. Bottom line, Confederates like Lee refused to accept the results of the 1860 election and chose armed rebellion, treason, to fight for a hideous cause, slavery. The 2 sides aren't equal, There were good guys and there were bad guys, and the good guys all wore blue. Now I had the research. I knew about the lost cause and how it infected me, how it infected the Army I loved and West Point. Uncomfortable had converted to anger, to passion. Yet I couldn't convince anyone. I tried. In 2011, West Point had lost more than 100 graduates killed in the wars on terror. Yet we had no single spot to recognize the 1,550 graduates who, in Lincoln's words, gave the last full measure of devotion to the nation, who died in battle. I chaired the memorialization committee and came up with an idea to create a single memorial room to the more than 1,500 West Point grads who in Lincoln, who I said gave the last full measure of devotion. It was in this building, Cullom Hall. Everyone loved the idea of the new memorial room, but one problem. Should Confederate West Point graduates who died in gray go in this room? I argued brilliantly, just ask me, no to traitors, no to those who killed U.S. Army soldiers to create a slave republic. And I briefed the superintendent, our college president, and senior leaders, gave them my argument, and I lost. Could not convince them. They voted to honor the Confederates. I went home, defeated, tail between my legs, to tell my wife they wouldn't listen to my brilliant argument. And she asked, well, did you tell them why this is so meaningful to you? Did you fess up about your own background? I said, well, no, I tell other people's stories. That's what I'm a historian. It's too uncomfortable for me to fess up about that. Well, she said, if you don't tell your own story, you will never convince anyone. Of course, she was right. And they never put those Confederate names in there because the black graduates of West Point came to the rescue and stopped it. Yeah, they did. They did. It wasn't me that won. I couldn't figure it out. But the black graduates found out about it. They did Freedom of Information requests. We had an emergency meeting. They never had an emergency meeting at West Point. And they voted to exclude it. But I wasn't allowed to even come in the room because they were so angry with me about this. So how do I tell my story? Well, in 2017, I did just that. A month after the white supremacist violence in Charlottesville, Washington and Lee invited me to give a talk called Robert E. Lee and Me. The same place I received my commission, the first time I've been back in, I don't know how many years, 30 years, 33 years. And I told my story, revealed my own background, and called Lee a traitor for slavery, standing over his grave. Told my college to deal with its racist past, its racist legacy. And what was the reaction of the packed, nearly all-white audience? A standing ovation. Facts don't change people's minds, but stories do. That same year, when white supremacists marched in Charlottesville, I wanted to write about the base names, named for the enemy. But with President Trump in office, it was too difficult for me to do in uniform, too hot for the Army and West Point. So in 2020, I retired so I could openly discuss this issue. Now, I was a convert on a mission, Paul on the road to Damascus. I wrote a book. In the book, I not only told my story and the story of Confederate monuments, I told the stories of those heroes hidden from me as a kid. I don't want less history. I want more. I found the story of Samuel Tucker in my hometown of Alexandria. Born in 1913, he had to bootleg an education, as he said, traveling by streetcar to D.C. to get a high school education. Then he went to Howard University. He wanted to be a lawyer, but no law school would take him, so he passed the bar on his own. In 1939, he had led the first sit-in in American history to integrate the Alexandria City Library. Then he fought in a segregated unit in Italy in World War II before coming back to Virginia and arguing more than 150 civil rights cases. Samuel Tucker is my hero now, and we all need heroes. My hometown named a new elementary school after Tucker. Hope. I found hope. And I tried to tell as many people as I could, as many stories as I could. I wrote a bunch of op-eds arguing that the nation must stop honoring Confederates, especially in the military. Now I wanted to make other people uncomfortable. Then, in the summer of 2020, a policeman in Minneapolis murdered George Floyd. Congress at last passed legislation to change the name of everything in the Department of Defense that commemorated Confederates. President Trump vetoed the bill because he too revered Robert E. Lee and didn't want to change the names. But Congress overrode his veto by a supermajority. The base names would change. I was so excited. I wrote more, lectured more. No one else had written about Confederate commemoration in the military, and it was national news, and I was the only expert. Turns out the Biden administration likes experts. And in January of 21, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin asked me to serve on the naming commission. What's the definition of a nanosecond? That's how long it took me to say yes. Highest honor of my career. Again, I raised my right hand and said that anti-Confederate oath. Our mission: remove, modify, or rename everything that commemorates Confederates in the Department of Defense. Finish our work by September of 2022. And we found 1,111 items, from base names to street names to ship names to monuments. And I'm proud to report that we did something that perhaps no other government project I know of has ever done. We finished on time, under budget, and we had 100% of our recommendations accepted and implemented. I know, I'm proud of it too. Thank you. I pat myself on the back all the time. Our main task was to change the names of those 9 Army bases. And as we went to each post to tell them and get their input, they always told me, "You're changing history." No, we're changing commemoration. At West Point, we will teach the Battle of Gettysburg every year. Every year, Pickett will charge, and every year, Lee will lose. Commemoration is about our values, who we honor, who inspires us. You couldn't tell the story of John Brown Gordon to all the soldiers who were stationed there. It's too awful. So after we visited the post, we asked the American people what they thought on a website, and we received 34,000 names of ones that they thought it should be named after, including the name Fort Spears, as in Britney Spears. So the American people have a sense of humor. But our new names, they inspire. And here's an example. Fort Benning, Henry Benning, the namesake of Fort Benning, never served in the U.S. Army. This is the home of U.S. Army infantry and armor. Yet he argued for secession to protect slavery starting 12 years before the Civil War. He once said that he would choose famine and pestilence for his home state of Georgia rather than ending slavery. And after the war, he fought successfully to create a white supremacist Jim Crow society. Our new namesake, Hal and Julia Moore. Hal Moore is famous for fighting in the first big battle of the Vietnam War, Ya Drang, made famous in the Mel Gibson movie, We Were Soldiers. But we named it after the Moore family. Julia Moore was an Army wife for decades, raised 6 kids, and when Hal was in Vietnam, dozens of his troops were killed or wounded. Notification of that horrible news came from a telegram delivered by a cab driver. Julie Moore, horrified, had the cabbie stop by her house first, and she went to deliver the news, comforting the family. She forced the Army to start a casualty notification process. We named that post after an Army family, and I attended the ceremony. All the Moore children were there, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, the troopers of the 7th Cavalry Regiment from Vietnam were present. Now that post has changed its motto. It's now Be More, inspirational. Here's another name. Fort Polk in Louisiana honored Leonidas Polk. He founded the University of Sewanee to educate pro-slavery Episcopal clergy. During the Civil War, he was called the Fighting Bishop. Military historians widely consider him to be the worst general of the war. No small feat. We changed the name to honor Henry Johnson. Johnson fought in the segregated Harlem Hellfighters in World War I. The entire 93rd Division fought with the French because General John Pershing, the American commander, didn't want black soldiers. Johnson was wounded 29 times, became one of the first Americans to receive the French Croix de Guerre. Teddy Roosevelt called Johnson one of the bravest soldiers in the American history. And when he returned to the U.S., they had a parade down Fifth Avenue. And when he got to Harlem, they started to call his name Black Death. He never received care for his wounds after the war or a pension, and he died in poverty. 100 years later, President Obama awarded him the Medal of Honor posthumously. Now we have a fort named after him. You see, it's never, ever too late to do the right thing. Let me say that again. It's never too late to do the right thing. And here's one of maybe my favorite. Fort Lee, the home of U.S. Army logistics, is now Fort Gregg Adams. Charity Adams was the highest-ranking black woman in World War II. She commanded a battalion of all black women, the 6th AAA Postal Battalion. They took a broken mail system in Europe and working around the clock ensured the troops and the folks back home got the mail. Lieutenant General Arthur Gregg was the highest ranking black officer in the Army when he retired. He commanded the largest battalion in Vietnam and helped integrate the Fort Lee Officers Club. In April, we went to the most important ceremony in my military and academic career. The descendants of the 6th 888 Postal Battalion were there, and so too was Lieutenant General Gregg, a spry 95 years old, inspirational. They fought for their country. They will serve to inspire all soldiers and all Americans. They are true American heroes. Fort Lee is the home of U.S. Army Logistics. It's the most diverse workforce in the country, with 50% black soldiers. And Fort Lee is outside Petersburg, Virginia. It's a majority African-American city. The Battle of Petersburg in 1864 saw the United States Colored Troops, the USCT, fight with distinction and glory, and Lee's soldiers slaughtered the black POWs there. Now we've named it after 2 U.S. Army officers, 2 logisticians, 2 African Americans, 2 Americans who fought for this great country, 2 true heroes. And my wife and I, as well as other members of the commission, were there to see it. Huzzah. I spent 20 years railing against the commemoration of Confederates, especially in the military, and now those names gone. See, before the name changes, we couldn't tell soldiers about Gordon or Benning or Polk. Their stories were too awful. They represented the worst parts of America, slavery and segregation. Now all soldiers can hear the inspirational stories of Charity Adams, Arthur Gregg, Hal and Julia Moore, and Henry Johnson. Now our posts represent our values. I'm proud of the small role I played, proud of the bipartisan commission, proud of the Army, proud of the nation. And the reason we changed those names, stop that commemoration of Confederates, is because the American people, through our elected representatives, told the military to change. You made it happen, and all of you should be proud that we commemorate those who reflect our values. So let me make sure that I accomplished my mission. I'm a soldier today. There are a few takeaways. Remember that Confederates chose treason, killed U.S. Army soldiers, and tried to destroy this country we love to create a slave republic. They do not deserve our commemoration. Confederate monuments created decades after the Civil War celebrate white supremacy and the end of biracial democracy. Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, and 2 million U.S. Army soldiers, including 180,000 black soldiers, destroyed chattel slavery, freed 4 million men, women, and children from human bondage, and saved the United States of America. So I told you history through my own story. Why? Because stories change people's minds more than facts. And I hope you will study the history of your family, of your town, of your state, of your country. History makes us uncomfortable. So what? We Americans aren't made out of cotton candy. We can handle uncomfortable. When we recognize our true history, we become more empathetic. Only then can we agree on policies to make our country better. But people won't change until they understand our history. So today, we recognize that we have come a long way, and we have a long way to go. Today, we celebrate true American heroes. They inspire us. Tomorrow, I believe, that we will act to make our towns, our states, and this great nation we love a better place for all Americans. Thank you very much. And now, we'll have plenty of time. If anybody has questions, I'd love to answer them.
Raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you.
Can you email to this to all the white people in America? Why is there such a refusal to listen to the stories that contain the facts?
Yes.
People revere Robert E. Lee, but he was a traitor. And he has descendants today who have 78 million votes to get them elected to high office.
Well, my best thing would say, can't we just send them all my book? History is dangerous because it challenges our myths and our identity. And when people challenge your myth and identity, the reaction is ferocious because you grew up with those. But I really believe that we can change. But the reason we can't change policies is because we can't change our history. And I would compare that to what the Germans have done. So I've lived in Germany for like 4 years, 3 years in the 80s, and then almost 8 months in 2016. And they have, when I first was there in the 80s, there's almost nothing about the Holocaust. And then I went back there in 2016, and there are these stumbling stones outside every house where a Jewish person was taken and sent to the camps to remind people all the time. There are hundreds of thousands of them now. The town when I was in, Wiesbaden, had recreated the synagogue, and the names of all the Jews that were taken and where they were slaughtered was there. There were new museums in almost every town around there. And what it had done was change the DNA of Germany. And the result of that, I believe, my analysis of that was, in 2015, because they had changed so much, they brought in 1 million Syrian refugees, 1 million people of color into that. If it had been us, it would have been 4 million people of color that we would have brought in at one time to the United States. Could you imagine us doing that? I can't. And the reason is we have not internalized what happened in slavery and segregation. If we don't do that, if we don't confront our own history, we cannot change the policies. And that's why so many places want to stop us from learning that policy. And that's why it's so important for us to do that. And I will tell you what I'm doing by telling my own story is really the same thing that feminists and black scholars have been doing for years, which is to tell a story through your own story. Tell a story. But there just aren't as many, there aren't as many white dudes my age doing the same thing. But I think we all have that story to tell. If we research our own town, our own state, all of these things, they're all there if we could just tell it. I just picked mine because I'm like the Forrest Gump of the lost cause, But I think that there's plenty of, everybody has that story if they want to tell it. And that's how we change, I think. Great question, man.
Thank you very much. I want to piggyback off of the question that was raised over here because I get the impression that today you were preaching to the choir, and the choir was very appreciative. But the problem is, what about those large hordes of non-choir members? What you've done is certainly to be commended, but my final question kind of is, what's the likelihood, what's the probability of non-choir members coming and undoing what has been done? Is it possible, and what can be done to prevent these things from being rolled back to the previous condition?
Right. So it's a great question, sir. So I would tell you, if you had told me, so I've been working on this in the Army and at West Point for years, for almost 2 decades, and I didn't think anything. And I retired to try to change this. And it's changed every place. And I went to every one of this. I went to half the ceremonies of changing the names. And so West Point, Lee Road, gone. It's Grant Road. So we have a barracks named when I was and I chaired the committee, named after Benjamin O. Davis Jr. So there it is. I think that is happening now. Of the 2,000 Confederate monuments in the country, I think maybe 300 have gone. So we have work to do, and I hate the law that Mississippi has, Alabama, Tennessee, these heritage laws that prevent local communities from dealing with these Confederate monuments. I hate that, and that's what I wish would change, so that I'm not going to tell some county you have to get rid of yours, but if the people of that town want to get rid of it, because that's who put it up, then they should have that ability. So I think understanding it and going after that which you can change is amazing. And so I came in here last time I was here at the 2 museums. I went into the Civil Rights Museum, and there was the rookie class of the Mississippi State Police. I couldn't believe it. The Mississippi State Police were in there getting a class, and half of them were people of color. It blew my mind. I had no idea. So I think that there is. So we have come. I go back to that. We have come a long way. We have a long way to go. And I think it requires fighting at every school board. It requires people running for those offices and telling your own story as a way of doing that. But am I going to bet against the United States of America? No, I'm not. I served in uniform, including my ROTC time, 4 decades. And I believe that this country can do something to change. And I've seen it at every one of these posts. They've changed that. And now everybody hears the story of Henry Johnson. Everybody hears the story of the Moore family, of Charity Adams and Arthur Gregg. So I do believe it's possible, but listen, it's hard. It's hard work, and it requires enormous. So do I think it can change? Yes. Will there be another incident of racial injustice in this country, like George Floyd? It happens every day. And will one be get that kind of publicity? Yes. We know it will. It's been happening every time. And so I think being ready to change when the next one of these comes, I mean, it's a hard fight. I don't mean to say it. I don't know. I know that the military has changed. I'm really happy about that. I hope to see one day in my lifetime that the Confederate monuments in Jackson are no longer there.
So one of the things that I've noticed as I've navigated some of these circles, and your book brought a lot of this to mind, is that there is the reason why your work was necessary was because over the years, people repeatedly allowed short-term consequences to dictate the decisions that they made instead of thinking about the long-term consequences that were going to result as a result of their decisions. And what I would like to know is, as a leader yourself, what would you say to individuals who are in leadership positions who are allowing the short-term consequences of people's opinions, right? How others may feel about them being rejected by their internal circles to dictate how they make decisions that could have long-term impacts on societies 10, 20, 50, 100 years from now?
It's a great question, and one that, when I was in a leadership role in the U.S. Army, I did not have the freedom to be able to go after these like I wanted to. I told the story, but I had no ability to change. And so it turns out I had way more influence outside once I left the Army than I ever did inside it. Now, you can't shut me up, and I will talk to talk to anybody I possibly can about this. I've probably given 250 talks since the book came out in 2021. And I do it because you've got to repeat the message over and over and over and over again. And, my wife is like, Ty, you're telling the same stories over and over again. I said, well, sometimes you got to do that. You got to do that repetition. So I don't know what to tell a politician because I've never been in his shoes or her shoes, what to do about that. I do know that there is a moral imperative to do the right thing on this. It's a moral issue for me. And because I grew up believing these lies, I find it a moral imperative to do whatever I can. And I think there are other people that are doing the same thing. But I have no idea what to tell politicians except to write op-eds, to tell them about this history, to make them look at this beautiful museum and to tell honest stories. Because it won't kill. This is the thing. It's not going to hurt you. Literally, it does not hurt to learn the truth. It makes you a better person. So I think continuing to write and to show people this museum, I was so glad. I must have seen, I don't know how many hundreds of children I saw going into that museum, including children from Sega Academies that are going in there now. That's incredible. Hats off to everyone who's making sure that happens. But listen, I don't know. I'm just going to keep fighting my fight. I hope you continue to fight your fight. But I do think it has made a difference over the course of my lifetime. I was born into a racial police state. I was born into an apartheid regime, a one-party racial police state. That's not the case now. So I think that we have come a long way, but man, do we have a long way to go. Thank you I'm sorry I didn't answer that better.
We have a comment from the live stream from Lori Neff. She says, in 1965, my fifth grade teacher told us that, quote, carpetbaggers were terrible people who had come here to destroy our Southern way of life. She says, I grew up in Jackson, learning Dixie was required.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing. We took down a plaque at West Point that equated on the ones, carpetbaggers are those people that came from the north, and supposedly they were coming to steal. So there wasn't anything to steal in the South after the Civil War. 60% of the wealth was gone. There was nothing here to steal. But they came down really to help out. And anyway, at this plaque at West Point had, on the one side, carpetbaggers, and it was trying to show the opposite of that. And the opposite, it had a picture of the KKK. And so we got rid of that. That's now no longer there. But that's the sort of way. And then there was another plaque there. The same plaque had two things. It had plantation slavery of the South and industrial slavery of the North, as though what the Irish went through was the same as chattel slavery. No, that's not true. So understanding that what the real history is here is incredibly important. And when you have the real history, you can't unknow it.
My question concerns something that we had here a month ago. Dr. Jones presented his book on white Christian supremacy. And he says that the religious issue actually began before Columbus discovered America, that it began back in the 1450s through the papal announcements, which the world at that time was all Catholic. My question is, how did, you mentioned religion with General Lee, how did religion play a role in the development of the South?
Yeah, I'm just not an expert on that. I mean, I know that the white citizens of the South looked to the Bible to explain slavery, and they had there was one or two parts of the Bible that said something about that. And also, there are places in there about when you can rape women. There's also places when you can stone them. I mean, so the idea that you're going to cherry pick one part of the Bible to explain that. Leonidas Polk founded the University of the South, Sewanee, to teach Episcopal clergy about how slavery could be seen as a positive good. Calhoun talks about the positive good. Hal Cobb, another governor of Georgia, says that as well. So they certainly figured out that slavery, I mean, remember, the financial rewards of slavery were unbelievable. So if you don't have to pay labor, and in fact, every time an enslaved woman has a baby, you increase the amount. Remember, enslaved people were worth more than everything except land in the United States. And in Mississippi, 50% of families owned enslaved people. 50%. And I always tell this to my students because they'll say, well, not that many soldiers owned enslaved people. And I go, well, how many of you in my class, say 20 people, how many of you own homes? And they would all raise their hand. No. How many of you, 20-year-olds, own homes? Like, well, nobody. This is because it's not about the soldiers, it's about their families, the number of families. That's the way you have to look at it. So there were more people in Mississippi that owned enslaved people then than owned stocks and bonds today. A higher percentage. So you just to understand the level, and that's the other we have to talk about. People just have to understand that just the cruelty and the horror of this system of slavery, and then how somehow that you can fuse Christianity and that it's okay with that. It's mind-boggling, but that's certainly what they did.
I'm not here to defend slavery, but I want to ask you something. The subject of secession never came up. Okay. If at the end of the war, if all these Southerners were traitors, why wasn't one of them tried? Not even Davis. Now let me finish. I know you're a moral man. You compare yourself to the Apostle Paul. I guess
just Jesus, a convert. Just that I'm a convert.
No. I heard you for 40 minutes. You know, Lincoln's been deified. Okay, look at his memorial. I guess you compare him to Jesus, right? But I want to know, other than Wirtz, who was the commandant at Andersonville, why wasn't any of these traitors tried?
I got the answer for you, so thank you for that question. So first of all, they were indicted. Lee was indicted, Davis was indicted. There were about 30 or 40 that were indicted. And it became very difficult to figure out which court they were going to be sent in, and if that court should have black men on the jury pool. So as they were trying to figure that out, in December of 1868, Andrew Johnson pardoned every single Confederate for treason. So they were granted amnesty for treason. So every single person who served in Confederate gray was granted amnesty for the crime of treason. Every single one. So that's your answer. You can't, if you are granted amnesty for the crime of treason, that's why. Amnesty. So they were, which is what, Christmas Day 1868, Andrew Johnson granted amnesty for the crime of treason.
Thank you. Please, for a minute, put on your military cap. Why did General Lee lose the Civil War? When you take into account that he had done so well in the war with Mexico, the American-Mexican War, when America got the northern half of Mexico out of that war, he was outstanding in that war. And then at the time, in the 1850s and 60s, the economy of the South was doing very well. The cotton kingdom of the world, you got all the resources, the economy was well. Why is it, how is it became, after such a brilliant military career and a good economic conditions to support the war, the military effort, how he came to lose the war?
Thank you for the question. Let me answer that. So why did this, remember that the reason that Lee becomes one of the great figures is in the western part, in Mississippi, all these, there's no Confederate that wins at all. So that if you're looking for one victor, Lee does win in 1862 and 1863, and he is a fine general. I'm not trying to say that he wasn't doing this. He's fighting for an immoral cause. But I think he was a good general until a better one came along, and that's Ulysses S. Grant. But also remember that every time that the U.S. Army goes somewhere, that enslaved people are leaving the South and going across lines. And so that eventually, that's 10% of the U.S. Army is black soldiers. And then you count all the logistics from enslaved people leaving the South. Remember, nearly 40% of the South is enslaved people. They leave. And so there are not enough people there because their system is so awful. People leave with their feet. Men, women, children all leave. So part of it is that the system the South has, based on logistics of slave labor and based on the fact that they're running factories with enslaved labor, it's a terrible, terrible way of fighting. And they lose because their cause is so bad. They also have much better leadership. Lincoln is a much better commander than Jefferson Davis. Much better. He is a brilliant man. I think one of the greatest presidents we've ever had. And Ulysses S. Grant, in my opinion, the finest soldier to ever wear Army blue. And he really understood at the political, strategic, operational, and tactical in a way that very few people have ever done before. Certainly did not Lee. Lee didn't think in those terms about combining the East and West together. So he ran up against better people. He had a better system in the United States, and he didn't have to worry about enslaved labor leaving him all the time.
Yeah, I'm kind of picking up what he asked, but I think the problem with General Lee, and it's funny that so many Mississippians revere Lee, because he cost Vicksburg, because Lee saw the war from a Northern Virginia perspective. He was very Northern Virginia-centric, and he refused to come down, or declined to come down to help at Vicksburg, said all the fighting will be over by then, and yet the fighting went on for another month. And once the North separated the Confederacy by taking the Mississippi River, it was just a matter of time. So I've always blamed Lee for the loss of the war. You know, he was on the U.S. side in the Mexican War and had all their resources. He was able to do what he wanted in the Civil War, and I think it cost dearly.
Yeah, I remember that. I do like to say, I don't like to say the Union Army. It's the U.S. Army, the same Army that I served in for so long, or the same blue uniform that I wore. When you say the Union Army, it makes you think as though they only fought one war, and that it was the only one. No, it's the same Army that we have today, with the same battle streamers, the same flags, and everything else. But and sometimes we get caught up in the X's and O's of military history and only look at the fighting itself. But we have to remember the bigger picture. What was the cause? Why were they fighting this war? And remember that the Army of Northern Virginia, Lee's Army, based its entire logistics on enslaved labor. So it is an immoral army fighting for an immoral cause.
In doing some family research, on my genealogy, I discovered that my great-great-grandfather helped to start the Southern Baptist Convention in 1847, before the Civil War. They separated from the National Baptist.
Right.
And one of their main beliefs was that the white man was superior to the black man.
That's right.
And they used the Bible
That's right.
to base that on. And whatever scripture they use still has not convinced me, but
No.
do you have any?
Well, I think this is true. The United Methodist Church today, I mean, the Southern Baptists convention, these are all split during that period over the question of slavery. Slavery was the great question during the war, during this period. Remember, there have been compromises all throughout to try to keep the U.S. together during that time, but the issue of slavery just could not go away. And as Lincoln said, the country will either be half free or half slave. And how is it going to do this? And it finally tore the country apart. But remember how terrible it would be is if the Confederates had won. Think about how awful that would be. The country would be balkanized. There may be multiple countries in North America. Would there be a cotton curtain where the South would have to put a wall to prevent enslaved people from escaping across it? Think about remember that there were 4 million enslaved people in 1860. This number was doubling less than every 20 years. Think about the horror, the murder. And as bad as it was in the Jim Crow era, it wasn't as bad as slavery. So just think about, thank God the Confederates lost. Thank God they lost. Thank God that Lee lost. And we can't separate that this was a cause to fight for slavery. And if we always remember that, then we're going to be, I think, then we'll understand what we need to do today. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. We have copies of Ty's book. We couldn't have them set up in the auditorium, so you'll have to go to the store to get them, but he'll be glad to sign them over here when you come back. Don't forget about the events that we have going on upcoming this weekend and tomorrow evening for the History Happy Hour, and then come back in 2 weeks for Larry Morrissey and the Community Health Centers. One more time, help me thank Ty
you so
Sedgley
much.
for this program.
Thank you.